It had been a year since the rape of my wife, and I was hoping that having my nephews over for the weekend would fill that space between us. Courtney was her name. Derek was mine, and the boys were Jacob and Frankie. My brother was taking leave from the military and wanted to spend a bit of time alone with my sister-in-law, as it had been months since they'd slept in the same bed. After going to the park and seeing the deep dark bar spots across the Winers, we circled the splintery old picnic table and cracked open a few beers, being sure to wrap them in cozies. We needn't any open container tickets. As the two boys dangled from the monkey bars and stuck their tongues out at one another, covered in mushed bun and processed meat, us adults took our time nursing our beers and watched them play. The food took its toll on us, and we would burp into our hands and pound on our chests to quell the gas buildup. I watched as Jerry, my younger brother, unbuckled his pants to give him a little more room to breathe. "Damn good to be back up topside," he leered over his open can, pushing his muscular stomach out in a mock belly, and watched the kids. "Damn it, Jake, quit pulling your brother's hair!" Jacob looked suddenly around and almost intuitively covered his behind, as he hid behind the metal pole of the public playhouse. "You been killing lots of orphans?" I asked my brother with a grin. Jerry, always the wise ass, said, "Of course, but you gotta get their parents first, otherwise you're just killing real kids." He slapped his knee. Courtney toyed with her hair, but his wife, Faye, giggled at the thought. "Damn, Jer, when do you plan on having the surgery to replace your dick with a gun? Be a lot bigger that way," I said. It was all in play, a jest that we did whenever Jerry and I were within proximity of one another. "You damn liberals and your soft, achy hearts." He swung his beer around to make it a bona fide point. "We'd be speaking some ching-chang language if we had boys like you guarding our borders." He raked the table with his knuckles. "Whatever happened to the great melting pot?" asked Courtney. "That's just the shit they tell you in school so's you know which ones to point the barrel at." Jerry made his finger into a gun and pointed it at me. "How's all that artsy BS going for you?" "It's alright," I said. That much was true at least. I'd been tasked to paint a mural for one of the local churches, and it paid well enough. Not exactly the sorts of stuff I enjoyed doing, but stomachs make noises if you wait long enough. After a bit of going back and forth and getting a few more libtards thrown my way, I packed my nephews into the back of the Jetta and rolled out of the park. Jerry caught us as we began to pull out of the parking lot, and he craned his head into the back seat, planting a firm kiss on the boys' heads. "Love you," he said. "Love you too," we all said back. Tennessee was a misery in that summer heat. Courtney fiddled with the AC knobs even though it was long broke. She chose instead to withdraw some papers from the glove compartment and began fanning herself with them. As the boys in the back would start to chatter and fight, Courtney would shoot them a look in the rear view. I knew all too well and they'd settle down. Of course, this game could only last so long. "Stop poking me," squealed Franny, the smaller of the two. "I'm not touching you," said Jake. "Now damn it, you quit," said Courtney, twisting in her seat and swatting with a light, soft palm that caught no legs as the boys pulled them beneath themselves. I laughed. I wish I could be on her side, but kids crack me up. "It's so hot." She pulled her shirt down and fanned her cleavage. "I'm hungry," whined Frankie. "You just ate," I said, flicking on the radio. We pulled into the driveway and the kids unbuckled themselves and began chasing one another around the car. Courtney wrangled them in, and forced them to help carry the leftover dogs and styrofoam cooler into the side door leading to the kitchen. After we were sure all the supplies were tucked away in their places, Courtney moved to the thermometer. I said about making a sugar sandwich on a paper plate and stopped little Frankie as he tried darting past me. "I'm not hungry," he said. I shrugged and let him go after his brother, and bit into the sandwich, watching them make shit up, only the way brothers can. "You shouldn't do that," said Courtney. "He said he wasn't hungry," I said as I deposited the rest of the soggy sandwich into my mouth. I tossed the plate into the trash and turned across the linoleum to place a hand around her midsection. I went in to kiss her on the neck as I gently lifted her brown hair. But she ignored me and rushed away to lay on the couch in the living room. I entertained the boys and played video games, giving them a straight beatdown in Smash Brothers. They would jump with the controller in their hands, twisting to gain some apparent advantage. As I saw Courtney make her way towards our bedroom, I rose and handed the controller off to Jake, telling them I'd be back and rustling his hair. Quickly, I shut the bedroom door behind me and locked it. She was already tucked beneath the blanket as I edged my way under the covers. I placed my hand on her hip and pressed my face into the wild mess of hair that waited for me. Inhaling, I allowed my hand to wander and explore its way up the side of her nightgown. She made no noise, so I continued, walking my fingers under the material until it came to her breast. I began to squeeze and push up against her backside, but then she slammed her armpit shut and scooched away. I sighed. "Sorry." She was crying. "When?" I asked, not meaning for her to answer. "I don't know." As her shoulders shook in the dark, I did the only thing I knew to do and rubbed it gently, hoping that maybe my familiar touch would help. I don't think it did. I really wish it did. A knock came on the door and I went to it, stepping into the hallway and shutting our bedroom door. "We unlocked Marth," said Jake. "Can you beat him for us?" "You know I can," I said. After putting the boys to bed, I stepped onto the back porch and watched the bugs spiral around the outside light. Always one smoke at night. I haven't been able to cut it more than that, no matter how I try. Our home, an old peeling white house with a shoddy foundation in the Tennessee countryside, always brought me a calm sort of peace in the nightmare. No neighbors for miles, just trees and the sounds of the night animals. I sat on the wobbly plastic lawn chair and watched the tree line at the edge of our lawn. When would it be all right to touch the woman I loved? Would it ever be all right? I was struck with a guilty sort of frustration. I knew that wasn't the way I was supposed to be thinking about it. I shouldn't blame her. I shouldn't blame my own wants. There was only one bastard in this whole world I could blame. I'd been off to work when it happened. The police said it was a premeditated sicko. He'd been waiting for her to return from her shift at the gas station. He must have been stalking the house to learn our routines. That haunts me every time I think about it. There was someone out there waiting for us to let our guard down so he could take what he wanted. Worst part was, they never caught him. It didn't take long till I asked a friend of mine to help me set some bear traps up around the property. If he ever comes back and makes his way through that first line of defense, I swear I'll kill him myself. She couldn't go back to work for a long time, and eventually lost her job. That only made me worry more. It meant she was home by herself often, but she assured me she was careful. I reached down to toss the cigarette butt into the metal bucket beside me. And that's when it caught my attention. I shifted and cocked my head to the side for a better look at the thing out there. Hidden within the shadow of the tree line was an unmistakable pair of glowing yellow eyes as the two lights obviously moved with a tether betwixt them. My knee-jerk reaction was that it was a human, perhaps even the returning bastard himself. But no human's eyes glow like that in the dark. It couldn't have been an animal either, as the eyes didn't have the distinct eye shine quality that nocturnal animals often have. They didn't just reflect, they glowed. The light was coming from the eyes. They bobbed and weaved briefly, and then it almost seemed they knew I saw them. And they froze in an impossible position, for the thing that wore them must have been at least 10 feet tall. That's when I could feel my heart beating in my ears. Then the pair of eyes disappeared into the trees, and I questioned whether they'd even been there. I returned to the house and locked the back door, then proceeded to tiptoe through the house and make sure that all the doors and windows were locked. What were those things? Eyes? Can I even be sure that's what they were? I was jittery, on edge. That's all. As I settled onto the couch and flipped through a bit of the Nabokov's Ada by lamplight, I heard the creaking of footsteps coming down the hall and tensed momentarily, sure that an interloper had broken into my home. Then I softened at the realization that the pale face staring at me from the hallway was Courtney. "It's-a me," she said, putting her hands up and pulling her lips tightly. "Amadio," I said, and patted the couch next to me. She came over and clicked the TV on as I continued my reading. The old square box hummed to life, and the blue light spilled across the living room floor as a woman whispered from the box about the next piece of jewelry that was on sale. Courtney played with the volume on the remote until the woman was talking normally. Then she channel surfed, but this didn't seem to do enough to distract her from my presence. "What you reading?" she asked me. I titled the book so the title was on full display. She pinched her face. Gross. "What?" I asked with a cracking grin. "You're the one that recommended it." "Incest," she said, shaking her head. "They love each other, right?" "Sure, but they're brother and sister." "What, you wouldn't love me if I were your brother?" I asked. "Not like that." She let out a yawn, followed by a nice, wide, genuine smile. "I don't know. You'd be a pretty hot sister to have." I winked at her. "Gross," she repeated, but she followed it up with, "It's a pretty good book, I guess." I dog-eared the page and sat on the side table. "Can't sleep?" Courtney yawned again. "Nope, wish I could. My mind's tired, but my body doesn't seem to know about it. I hate when that happens." Without thinking about it, I interlocked my fingers into hers, and she didn't seem to mind. We watched the infomercials with idle curiosity, occasionally pitching in with our own less-than-witty observations. We fell asleep holding hands and somehow made our way into a haphazard snuggle on the couch sometime throughout the night. I awoke to the solid bonk of a hollow plastic baseball bat against my forehead. It was Jake. "Yes?" I asked him, squinting through the dim daylight pouring from the nearby window. "It's a blue sunshiny day," exclaimed the 11-year-old. I peeked down and saw that Courtney had placed her head on my chest during our sleep. "Well, that's nice." Another bonk to the forehead. "Listen here, you little shit. I'm gonna take that bat and beat the crap out of you with it." I'm getting up, I pleaded, attempting to shift from the spot on the couch without waking Courtney. But this did not work, and she began rolling off the couch. We stretched, wiped the sleep from our eyes, and started on breakfast. I shook my head as I looked up at the clock on the stove. 5:49. You little bastards. I whipped the eggs as Courtney warmed the pans with butter, and we stuffed ourselves on French toast. "What's on the docket for today?" I asked the sticky faces of my nephews. The eyes from the previous night were quickly making their way into the back of my mind. Frankie seemed to ponder this, but his larger brother had no problems coming up with a rousing suggestion. "More Smash Brothers!" he exclaimed. His brother nodded in affirmation. "Go wash up and get ready for the butt-kicking of your lives," I growled, pitching my fingers into claws. They giggled and ran to the bathroom. "Don't forget to brush your teeth," I hollered after. Courtney came up behind me and wrapped her cool, thin, freckly arms around my belly. It felt warm. "I'm sorry I've been such a bitch," she said. I held her arms in mine, crossed my midriff and sighed. "You haven't." She kissed my back, and the arms were gone just as quickly as they'd arrived. This had me in good spirits for the rest of the day. Me and the boys played the video game until about noon, taking turns with the two controllers and, occasionally, coaxing Courtney into playing around. She wasn't particularly good at it, but she was a good sport whenever one of us would spike her character off the map. To my nephew's complaints, we tucked the console away and decided to head out while we still had some daylight. We would go down to the old gravel road leading to our house, and walk one of the old hiking trails for a nice break of pace. They objected, but as we walked the trail for maybe 10 minutes, they forgot all about it and were taken up in another game altogether. They chased each other up with sticks, sword fighting. Me and Courtney kept a wavering eye on them. As the sun beat down on me, I wished I'd taken a note from Courtney's book, as she was decked out in a nice and breathy yellow sundress, straw hat, and sunglasses. I took up a stick of my own to assist in the steeper inclines, and when Frankie, red in the face, called out and said he was ready to go home, I was silently thankful. I returned home and began making homemade pizza, with all the fixing on half and only pepperoni on the other. Frankie watched in horror as we placed green peppers and onions on the side intended for Courtney and me. I stuck my tongue out at him and he reciprocated the gesture, shaking his head all around. Gathering into the living room with our plates of pizza, we put on The Lion King. It was a movie we owned, and we'd seen it several times already, but the kids love it. Courtney dozed off and I read my book as the boys were glued to the TV screen. As the credits closed out, Courtney helped me put them in bed, and I kissed her goodnight on the forehead. She smiled back at me through sleepy eyes. There I went, out into the back porch for my one smoke of the night. I sat out there, watching the tree line, sitting in that wobbly plastic chair. I was immediately struck by the thought of those yellow glowing things out there I'd seen the previous night. All day I'd been able to forget about them. But there I was again, waiting for the little dots of lights to appear. My pulse quickened as I stared out into those woods, with only the little outside light to keep me company. Watching. Waiting. Nothing. I finished my cigarette and went to go, and put it into the metal bucket, but stuck around for a few minutes longer, again becoming entranced with the small bugs circling the outside light. I caught them out of my periphery. The pair of eyes were there, glowing a piercing yellow. They moved methodically in the darkness like dandelions through a dream. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my entire body grow cold as an innumerable series of eyes lit the night in a yellow firefly glow. Each new pair opened somewhere out there at an incalculable distance, serving to push my stomach further up my throat. It was an excruciating moment that I wanted to scream, but found no voice. Then the yellow dots along the tree line disappeared, and I was left a chilly statue on my back porch. I watched and waited, and no noise came from the black night beyond the crickets and nightbirds. I stepped into the house and once again checked the other two outside doors, making sure they were secure and finding myself praying for the first time since I was a child. What are those things? There were hundreds of them. They must be some weird light phenomenon. My mind searched for some physical explanation. Is that ball lightning? No, they were eyes. Obviously, they were eyes. I stood in the kitchen by myself in the dark. "I'm thirsty," Frankie said. I jumped, whipping my arms around and almost letting out a yelp. I smacked the light on and turned to the small face of the boy. "Hey, buddy." "I'm thirsty." I poured him a glass of water and watched him gulp it down greedily. "Having a hard time sleeping, Frank?" I asked him. He handed me the glass and I deposited it in the sink, leaning against the counter. Frankie shook his head. "I was sleeping okay, but the truck lights are really bright." "Truck lights?" He nodded. "They keep lighting up our room." My blood ran cold. I darted down the hallway and rushed into the guest room the boys shared. Just as I pushed the door in, a pair of those inhuman, glowing yellow eyes drifted across the window near Jake's bedside table, briefly splashing the interior of the room. I gathered the boys into the living room with a bundle of blankets, convincing them that it would be a whole lot of fun to camp on the floor there and construct a clubhouse of sorts. Courtney protested to me, shaking her awake, but at seeing my hysterics, she followed suit. As the boys fell to sleep in the living room, me and the wife sat in the kitchen as I cooked up a pot of coffee. "Don't sleep tonight, buckaroo." "What's going on?" she asked, sitting at the small round kitchen table and wiping the sleep from the corners of her eyes. "I saw something out there," I said, pointing to the window of the kitchen that looked out into the backyard. Her back stiffened in her seat, and her eyes shot wide for a split second. Her hands were clasped over the table. "What do you mean?" she asked. "There." "What? What's out there?" "Eyes out there," I said. "You mean there's people out there?" She stood to look out the window. "I don't know. Not now, anyway. Or maybe I saw one of them outside the boys' room." She turned to look at me, then walked over to the fresh pot of coffee and poured herself a cup, returning to sit at the kitchen table with it, stirring it round with a plastic straw and watching it swirl into a light tan. We waited for morning and ran through 2 pots of coffee, constantly going back to the pot to replenish our cups so that we would not succumb to the misleading nature of sleep. It crept on us and our eyes began to bruise in dark circles. But still we maintained a modicum of composure as our old house would make its shifting, creaking noises. The pair of us watched the clock on the stove, and as the clock began to go on into the morning hours, the darkness outside did not let up. If anything, the dark sky out there only seemed to take on a deep liquid quality. Darkest before dawn, isn't it? That didn't seem to be the case, as dawn never came. "Where's the daylight?" asked Courtney. I shook my head. "Doesn't seem it's coming." craziest shit I've ever seen. It honestly was. An eclipse? I offered. As time trucked on, so too did the little digital clock on the stove. 6:30 in the morning, and the blanket of the night sky with its absent stars lingered still overhead, as an ill omen. I dumped the remainder of my coffee into the sink, feeling sick and sweaty from consuming so much of the stuff. Then I threw the ceramic cup into the sink, watching it shatter. "Why?" asked Courtney. "When's the damn daylight going to come, huh?" I asked, putting my hands out. She shook her head at me and removed the broken cup from the sink, throwing the pieces into the trash can near the doorway. She sighed. "That doesn't give you the right to act like a child." I slumped my shoulders. "You're right. I'm just so scared," she asked. "I know, me too. But throwing a tantrum isn't going to help anyone." I put my hands up. I know. Jake entered the kitchen, wiping his eyes, and Frankie followed behind. "What's all that racket?" asked Jake. "Nothing, kiddo," I said. "It's dark out," yawned Frankie. "No shit." I pivoted and leaned toward the window over the sink, scanning the tree line. No eyes. But somehow their absence was even worse. I could barely see the outline of the trees so far out there. Then the idea struck me, and I crossed the kitchen, pulling the landline from the wall mount and pounding my brother's number into the dial pad. I put the phone up to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then there was a click on the other end like someone was picking up. Just as I opened my mouth to start jabbering away, I stopped. Mouth open. Someone was breathing on the other end of the line. It was so audible that it almost felt as though the breath was coming straight down my neck. I shivered as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Hello?" I said into the receiver. Nothing responded. Just that heavy breathing. I swallowed. "Hello?" I asked again, this time hushed. Courtney watched me. "What's going on?" she asked, pointing to her ear. The boy stood quietly by. Dead air, then a click, followed by a droning electric tone. I sat the phone back in its cradle and turned to look outside. It was now entirely black out there. If it weren't for the light coming from the overhead bulb of the kitchen, I could scarcely say the backyard was a place that existed. Jake crossed the kitchen and looked at the clock. "Did we sleep all day?" "No," I said. "It's just dark out right now." That much was true. What was I to say? I wanted to say something that would comfort everyone. I wanted to be the macho man that stepped outside and screamed into the dark air. I wanted to do something, anything. But I was a crowded animal, unable to move, totally claustrophobic. I focused on my breathing and tried calming the boys with a wavering smile. Courtney corralled Jake and Frankie into the living room, turning on the TV. I tried the phone again, this time for the police. It rang 3 more times, and then I heard that familiar click noise. The breathing came. I slammed the phone in its cradle again. "Fuck!" I whispered. "Uncle Tarek said a bad word," said Frankie. "How the hell do you keep sneaking up on me, kid?" "Nuh-uh." I put a grin on my face, ushering him back into the living room. As we entered the room, my wife sent me a telepathic question: did calling the cops work? I shook my head, and she sunk back into the cushions. We sat on the couch, I tried to watch the TV, but my gaze kept wandering towards the dark bay window near the box. I watched it and waited for those eyes to come back. I wanted them to make their dastardly appearance so that I could at least be sure I wasn't losing my mind. They are out there. I don't know how, but they are out there. I shifted in my seat so my eyes could no longer linger towards the big window. The morning news was on. The whole rest of the world continued to turn, it seemed. It was supposed to rain today. It was supposed to be humid, said the weatherman. 8:30 came, and it was still dark outside. Darker than I've ever seen. Inky black, like we were at the bottom of the ocean. Jake and Frankie both seemed nonplussed by the absence of daylight, but that was the only thing I could even think about. Courtney rose from the couch and closed the living room curtains. Her knees quaked beneath her as she went, her attitude curt. I grabbed her arm as she went to shut the curtains. What if they come back? I whispered to her, eyeing the boys to make sure they couldn't hear me. It was already too late. What if who comes back? Asked Jake. Yeah, said Frank. No one, I smiled. Even children know when something's going on. The nervous energy had been coming straight off us, and they'd picked up on it. It was too late now. Courtney shot me a look I couldn't quite understand. You guys want to play some games? She asked the boys. They rejoiced and set the console up, situating themselves on the floor in front of the TV. As the music played, they chose their fighters and forgot, at least momentarily, about the strange darkness that enveloped our house. Courtney pulled me to the kitchen by my wrist and rushed her brown locks back in a quick swipe. I get you're upset, Derek, but you've got to get your shit together. She said the words, and I could almost feel them slapping me across the face. Had I really been so careless? Was I worrying the boys that much? Was I worrying her? I let out a bolt of air and nodded, relaxing my shoulder. You're right. I know you're right. This shit is just... it's so fucking weird. I know. Something slammed against the window with a loud thud, and we jerked in surprise, recoiling against the opposite wall. I looked at the window with gross fascination. It was a tentacle. How? It squelched against the glass, slithering along the cracking spiderweb it had created there. Please, God, don't break. Each individual suction cup seemed to have a mind all its own, as they pulsated rhythmically. I was stunned, and I glanced from the corner of my eye. I could see a duplicate look of horror scrawled on Courtney's face. The thunderous footsteps of the boys filled the quiet as they collided into one another in the threshold. I heard them screaming, but it was so far away. The tentacles writhing sped up in response to the sound of them. Without thought, I darted to the children, placing my hands over their mouths. Shh! I tried. Shh. Their screams petered off, and I watched as my wife quietly moved through the kitchen and back into the living room. Holding Jake and Frankie's hands, I followed. She threw open the bay window curtains, and I felt my stomach drop straight into the balls of my feet at the image waiting there for us. The whole window was covered in a mess of slimy tentacles, sliding in an orgy of thick mucus. The noise churned my stomach. Frankie was crying, trying to keep the audible whines to a minimum. Good boy, I briefly thought. She closed the curtains back. Let's not look at that, she whispered, eyes bulging from the dark circles around them. I nodded. Where's the gun? The bedroom closet, she said. Handing the boys off to her, I clicked the TV off and made my way down the hallway. I heard the house belt out another one of its creaks that we'd always chalked up to the shoddy foundation. I was sweating. My hands were clammy. It was difficult to load the single-shot 12 gauge with my shaking hands. I gripped the camo stock like death and quickly made my way back to the living room with a box of shells in the other. "Are they aliens?" asked Jake. "No, honey," said Courtney, rubbing his shoulder. How does she know that? I wondered. "But they are monsters," said Frank. "I don't know, kid," I said. "Sure looks that way, don't it?" A strange dry chuckle left my throat, and the boys looked at me with wide eyes. "Sorry, no, they're just octopuses. Octopi? Octopuses." "Both is right," said Jake. I looked at the boy. Under any other circumstance, he'd be teasing his brother for being such a crybaby. But not now. I didn't have the time to be impressed, though. I could hear the glass giving way on the big bay window. If anything comes through that fucking window, I'm going to blow it away. Would I, though? Yes. But it was only a single shot. If I got caught reloading, I'd be screwed. We waited, keeping our voices to a whisper. It seemed that if we kept the noise to a minimum, things out there would hardly pay us mind. Right? We hoped so. I braved a peek at the windows of the house sparingly, never wanting to get too near them. I could feel the previous night's pizza lurch up the back of my throat any time I caught the noise they made. Sick. What would it be like if they wrapped themselves around my ankle and whipped me into the darkness out there? I imagine they would clean the flesh from my body. I can't say how I knew it, but I did. "What are we gonna do?" said Frank. "Won't be okay," said Courtney through tears of her own. Hopefully she was right. I wanted her to be. This should all be some nightmare. Perhaps I was in a hospital somewhere, sweating in my bed from this fever coma. I was losing my mind, and I was somewhere else. This wasn't real life. This wasn't the way the weekend was supposed to go. I had to be sleeping. That must have been it. It wasn't. We listened to them, and as the noise grew too much to bear, we flung the bay window's curtains open. If we were going to listen to them, we may as well know when they were coming to get us, I reasoned. Then, splintering wood resounded through the walls, and Frankie let out a screech. The tentacles constricted the whole house, then twisted like, made tendrils into the dark night. We were left staring out the window into nothing. "Are they gone?" asked Frank, peering over Courtney's arm. I rose from my seated position on the hardwood floor and went to the window, squinting to cut through the swallowing shadows. I couldn't see anything besides the man reflected in its surface. "I think so," I said. I prayed. For an hour or so longer, I patrolled the house, moving quietly through the familiar structure. Frank had long cried himself into a sleep, and Courtney draped a blanket over him. The little 7-year-old tucked his forefinger into his mouth and sucked it. Jake picked up my copy of Ada and studied it, squishing his face in a bleh expression and placing it back in the spot on the side table. The tentacles could not be found pressed against any of the windows of the house, and this much served to calm my nerves. It felt almost normal. I collapsed into the kitchen chair, setting the shotgun across my lap and clicking the safety to the affirmative position. I craned my head back and looked at the ceiling. Courtney took the chair opposite me. "Hungry?" she asked. I shook my head. "Me neither. This shit's got me rattled." She rapped her nails against the table. "I feel sick. Want some IBs?" "Yeah." She fetched a handful of pills from the plastic bottle in the drawer near the sink and returned with a glass of water for each of us. We took the headache meds. "Why is it so damn dark out there?" she asked. "I think we should make a dash for the Jetta," I said aloud, and not too sure of myself. "You think so?" said Courtney. "It's right outside. We could make it, I think. Besides, it might be our best bet." "It's too dangerous," she said quickly. "There's gotta be a military strategy or something. We can't be the ones this is happening to. We should just wait it out." I smiled and reached across the table to grab her hand. "You might be right. You probably are. You usually are," I admitted. She returned my smile and pushed her fingers into a full handhold. "Thanks. At the very least, we should reinforce the windows with something," I said. "Is that a genuine plan of action I hear?" "Hell yes." We set about dismantling the tables with my toolbox, Jake standing by and holding tools as needed. His small face looked on with wonder as I would wriggle the wood apart with my pry bar and jump at each new order. Courtney had taken the shotgun, watching the windows. Her father had taken her hunting many times as a child, and she probably knew how to use the shotgun better than I ever could. I would joke with her sometimes and ask her if her father was a hunter, because goddammit, she sure was a fox. I smiled as I worked with this thought sloshing around my brain. I used a power drill to push the screws into the studs around the windows. As we ran out of wood, I removed the interior door of the bathroom to cover the bay window. And as we ran out of screws, I set about banging my thumb more often than nails. We could barely see through the boarded windows. As I flexed my hands and walked into the kitchen, I saw Courtney on the phone. She had it pressed to her ear, and as I approached to say something, she put a stiff, slender finger to her lips. Then she, just as I had, grew frustrated and slammed the landline into its cradle, lifting the gun back into her hands. "Who was that breathing?" she asked me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Someone is messing with us, right? I mean, what the hell?" "I think me and my assistant have worked up an appetite," I said, changing the subject. "Isn't that right?" I turned to Jake and lifted my hand to receive a high five. He beamed and missed my hand. "Darn it," he said. I chuckled at him. "It's alright. What do you want?" Jake tapped his finger on his chin, looking up at me thoughtfully. Tacos? Fresh out. Pancakes? Nope. Waffles? Try again. A sandwich? Bingo, I said, giving him the finger guns. With that, I put the 2 slices of bread out on the cutting board and began running mayo along their faces. "We're going to get out of this. We're going to be fine." I almost believed it. It had to have been sometime around evening when the power flickered off briefly. But it could have been much longer than that, as no light passed through the cracks in the wooden slats and debris we'd covered the windows with. That green digital clock over the oven was a godsend in those brain-melting, meaningless hours. My wife held onto the shotgun so that if any one of those tendrils decided to spring through the fortifications, she'd give it a good blast. I took the hatchet from my toolbox and gave my hammer to Jake. This set little Frank into a tizzy, as he was the only one left without a weapon. I gave him the plastic baseball bat and told him to be careful, with a wink. If he were forced to use the ridiculous thing in defense, the rest of us would likely be dead anyway. Something about the way the tendrils had left rattled my bones. I knew they could have broken through those windows. They could have easily reached into our home and constricted all of us to death. Why didn't they? The motivations of the entity or entities that had spawned forth those grotesque, slimy limbs were lost on me, to be sure. I can't say I know what exactly drove them, but I surely had a pulse on what they wanted. So again, why didn't they come and get it? I stepped up behind my wife sitting in the kitchen and began rubbing her shoulders. She closed her eyes and leaned into my thumbs. Courtney's hair was frizzy as ever, standing out in wild directions. I'd only ever seen it that way a handful of times. Once was when we'd been caught out in a storm. We'd run home from the nearby trail, having been caught in all the rain. As her hair dried, it popped up in all manner of comical ways. Now, she looked tired. And I knew her hair was that way due to the sweat. I don't think the AC is doing its job, buckaroo. Courtney let out a small noise. That feels nice. I pulled her hair off her neck and blew on the sweat there. What is happening? I asked her, and myself in a whisper. She shrugged. Wish I knew. You know, I never really believed in God, but I've been talking to him an awful lot recently. I know what you mean. I've been thinking about that sort of thing too. You think the boys will be okay? She asked. I think so. They're just a bit shaken up. Aren't we too? I sure am, I said, rounding the table and popping a squat across from her. Thanks for keeping me on my toes earlier. Courtney smiled at me as she pulled her hair into a ponytail, with a band on her wrist. What else am I here for? The lights of the house flickered as it groaned from beneath. It was like a nightclub scene with the flickering of the overhead light. I saw everything in glimpses of frames. Then it was black all around, and I heard the boys screaming from the living room. As the lights came back, I found myself standing. The little brothers had scrambled into the kitchen, clinging to Courtney by her nightgown, both on their knees. I muscled through my own terror and craned my head down to Jake and Frankie. I thought yous twos were supposed to be brave boys. I watched as Jake slid off the floor, holding up his hammer. I am, he said. I just couldn't see nothing. Frankie wasn't going to be coaxed out with any sort of injury to his masculinity, or called a machismo. Turning my attention back to my wife, I said, we should gather the candles. I can't believe I hadn't thought of it earlier. She sighed. I'm just so tired. Me too. You should sleep, I stated. She began to protest, but I followed this up with, we'll have to sleep sometime. We can do it in shifts. I'll take the first one, said Jake, holding the hammer up in his hands. All right, bud, I said. You and me take first watch. I tried to smile, and it felt wrong given the circumstances. But it seemed to swell his chest at least. I glanced at the clock on the stove and shuddered. It blinked 12 o'clock. We'd lost time. Looking over the assortment of candles, canned goods, and array of miscellaneous items thought to possibly be useful soon was not a reassuring layout. My eyes drifted to the small emergency kit before passing over the rest. We didn't have many supplies, and much of the food was canned veggies and fruits. How long will that last you and your little troop? Not long, I'd wager. I shook this thought and continued rummaging the nooks of our home, hoping to find the one true MacGuffin to save us all. What I found mostly was dust bunnies and spider webs that clung to my skin in translucent tickles. Nothing but insulation in the attic. Nothing but clothes, towels, blankets left in the closets. Courtney slept on the couch while Jake and I took up near the threshold leading from the living room to the kitchen, so that I could keep an eye on her sleeping form and the 7-year-old nestled to her bosom. I sat in the chair a while. Jacob sat at my feet. Jake, the chatterbox, couldn't stop talking, and I had to constantly shush him so that he'd keep his voice to a whisper. "You think the lights will go out again?" he asked. "Wish I knew, buddy." "No," I said, holding the single shot between my knees. "Do you think they'll be back?" "I hope not." "Me too." He traced his finger along the floor. "Aren't you scared?" "Of course," I said. "Sometimes you've got to be brave, though." He nodded and fell deeper into his mesmerizing circling finger. "Dad's brave." "He is," I said. The kid was right. My brother was possibly the bravest person I'd ever met. Even with all of his other faults, he never was the sort of person to back down from a fight. For a moment, I wish he were there with us in the house. He'd probably know what to do. But instead, it was me. "You're brave too," said Jake. I raised an eyebrow. "You think so, huh?" "Sure do." He looked up at me from the floor and directly into my eyes. "Thanks, Jake." I mussed his hair and he frowned at me. "You're a pretty brave little dude yourself." This planted a sure smile across his little face. Kids are so easy. As the time went on, and I responded to each whim of a question that came from Jake, a sense of normalcy crossed me, and it was calming. Worst of all, it also drooped my eyelids, and I could feel the sleep creep over my brain like fresh weeds. A sharp, mild pain in my knee came and jerked me awake. I looked down to see Jake, furrowing his brow and brandishing the hammer. "I know you're tired, but it's our watch, not mine." "Listen here, you little shit." But he was right, and I couldn't help but to chuckle at his disappointed expression. He looked like his father at that moment. That's the very second the scratching started at the back door, near the kitchen counter. I looked to the door, as did Jake. Then the boy turned back to look at me, and an unmistakable, abject terror radiated straight from his eyes and through my body. I stepped up from my chair and angled the gun's barrel at the back door, listening as hard as I could at the sound of the thing clawing at the base of the other side of that entryway. It sounded small, and it reminded me of a rodent clawing into a wall to make a nest. I neared the door cautiously. Jake and I listened to the unknown creature on the other side as it marred away with its claws. That's when the small sounds of an animalistic whine followed. The clawing stopped and we waited, never taking our eyes off that door. An unmistakable guttural growl could be heard, and the sick sensation in the pit of my stomach grew ever more. I knew what was on the other side of that door, didn't I? Jake. He jumped at the sound of his own name. Be careful. I'm going to open the door. I need you to be brave, all right? Okay, he said. His voice was small and far away. I felt for him, but I needed him to keep his wits about him if I intended to pull this off. If anything bad comes through there, you focus on shutting the door. He nodded. I closed the space between me and the door, unlocking it and swinging it open before my nerves could stop me. I was immediately met by a black and never-ending abyss, going on in the distance forever. As the door came in, so did the small whining critter that had been clawing at the door. A dog. A mutt, really. With spotted white and black fur, slid along the kitchen floor with a clatter and slammed into the threshold leading to the living room. Poor thing must be terrified. He disappeared somewhere around the corner, and I focused on the black air out there. I couldn't see a thing, and yet something was drawing me out to explore what it was. The most basic weakness in all human nature was springing forth like a chain on end, tugging me away to the unknown. I investigated the blackness out there, and could feel the call of the wild, the call of something I'd only ever dreamt of. It was all of creation that must be out there, in that empty nothingness. I felt little and bold all at once. Jake slammed the door shut and I blinked, turned to look at the boy as he locked it. I rubbed my temples and smiled at him. There's something out there. It's more than just those tentacles. It's more than just those yellow-eyed watchers. God is out there. I locked the door back as Jake skittered to find where the dog had run. I could hear the sound of my wife waking up and stretching, as well as little Frankie saying, "Get off, quit licking my face." Courtney entered the kitchen, putting a hand over her wide O mouth, and the dog followed, looking up at us, out of the side of his white eyes, tail tucked. As I hunkered down to give him a scratch behind the ear, the little fellow flinched. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." I reached out again slowly and began rubbing the fur around the side of his face. He leaned into it, and his back end began to shake to and fro. "We have a dog now?" asked Courtney. "It's probably the least strange thing to happen since yesterday," I responded, looking up from the dog to her. "I guess he can't stay out there with those," she shuddered, "things." "Yeah, he came to the door and I couldn't leave him. Poor thing must have been terrified out there all alone." He looked up into my face as if to say, "You've gotten that right, buckaroo." She nodded, as if to affirm this, and Jake stepped into the kitchen from the hall. "There he is," said Jake with a smile, shifting over to pet the dog. "What's his name?" "Well, he's got no collar," I said, taking up in a chair. "I guess that means you guys get to name him." For a second, I swear I saw a glimmer of a smile flash over Courtney's face as she poured the old coffee grounds into the trash can. "Steve," said Jake, looking into the calming, sad eyes of the mutt. "Steve's a man's name," I said. "Yep," said Jake. I shrugged. We were caught amid a dream, and still my nephew found a way to make a situation feel normal. "All right, then." The foundation shook beneath our feet once more, and we were left in the dark, scrambling for our gathered candles, with Steve barking at every motion we made. As the house was lit in the yellow glow of the small flames, a sense of security fell over us as we sat in the kitchen together. Still, I could not shake the feeling I'd been overcome with when I stared out into that night's air. It ran through my blood and made it difficult to breathe. "What's out there?" asked Courtney, peering through the cracks between the wooden slats secured before the window above the sink. She reached up on her tiptoes and squinted into a sliver. I can almost see nothing. I moved to her and leaned in as well. My nephews pet the trembling Steve on the floor. As I looked out through the cracks she did, I saw those same yellow eyes. But this time they were much closer than they had been when I'd seen them out in the forest. Now they were no more than 30 yards away from the house. Fuck that. I felt ice run through the length of my spine. "You see the eyes?" I asked my wife. She nodded. "Is that what you were talking about?" "Yup." I let the end of the word pop. The yellow eyes moved in a circular motion outside our home, like cult members around a bonfire. A small whimper came from my wife, and I turned to look at the tears rolling down her face. "Why?" she sobbed. "Why is this happening? I just don't understand." I reached out and touched her shoulder, but she flinched in much the same way that Steve had when I'd initially tried to pet him. "It's going to be all right, hon." No, it's not." She covered her mouth, choosing to stand in front of the stove and study the curled eyes atop it. I did the thing I almost always do in a moment of distress. I lashed out. "Fuck this," I hissed under my breath, and stomped to snatch the single shot lying across the kitchen table. I clicked the safety off and went to the back door, unlocking it, swinging it in. I pointed the barrel of the gun into the eternal night. Taking aim, I kept a pair of those glowing eyes in my sight as it moved across the edge of our back lawn. I squeezed the trigger and almost buckled under the weight of the recoil against my shoulder. I'd missed the glowing-eyed figure out there as its trajectory did not change even momentarily. The flash of the gun briefly illuminated the immediate area, and I was in awe. I turned to look at Courtney with an expression I hoped would convey my absolute terror. "Give me a candle, quickly." I handed the shotgun off to Courtney, and she attempted to reload it with her shaky, slender fingers. I took the lit candle and knelt near the edge of the open doorway. It was black, absolutely, and as I neared the candle to it, still, the ground there did not reflect any light. Because there's no ground there. I held the candle out of my right hand and tried to press my left hand out into what should have been our back porch. But instead there was only open air. Without warning, I was struck with vertigo, and I grew dizzy, dropping the candle. Courtney reached out to grab my shoulder, and I watched in a haze as the candle fell and fell and fell until its light was swallowed up. I didn't hear it strike anything before it disappeared. As the nausea subsided, I realized I was gripping onto the edge of the doorway, so that the veins there stood out. I slammed the door shut and flexed them. "There's no ground," I shouted. I looked to Courtney with her shoulders bobbing up and down as she held her hands in front of her face. The sobbing erupted from her furiously. With haste, I moved through the kitchen, towards the front of the house, into the living room, to the front door. I swung it open, squinting while looking down into infinite shadows beneath. I grabbed hold of the door trim with my right hand and swung my left foot out, hoping that it would touch the front porch. But my leg merely dangled into the open air. Somehow our home had been transported and suspended into some alternate reality. Or it had been lifted into space. Or it was limbo. Or hell. Or I don't know. I shut the door. Where are we? I returned and opened the dark fridge, pulling a beer from the crisper drawer, and sitting in the floor against the cabinets beneath the sink. I cracked it open, slurped down the foam, lit a cigarette, and chuckled to myself. If only to keep the madness away. Lil Frank came over to sit with me, placing a hand on my leg. "It's okay, Uncle Derek." His face was calm, and his reassuring grin felt warm, sincere. It broke my heart to say what I said next, but it came out of my mouth all the same. "No, kid. No, it's not." I cried, too. What with the tentacles and the darkness and the glowing eyes of the watchers out there, how could I not? I wept into my beer with quiet tears, and as Lil Frank watched me do it, I was reminded of the time I watched my father cry. He was a large, burly man that cussed, drank too much, fought too much, stank too much, but loved my mother just as well. I'd never thought he was capable of crying. I thought that was something only meant for children or women. But the day my mom went in the ground, he cried. And when he did, it didn't come out in meek whimpers, but howling, gushing torrents. He lay in bed for 3 whole days, and me and Jerry didn't know what to make of it. My brother and I continued to go to school to touch base with reality and come home, make our father something to eat, then leave it on his bedside table. The food there would be gone the following morning. The huge man in the bed grabbed me by the arm once and looked me into the eyes, pleading through an ocean of salty water. I didn't know what to do, so I left him, jerking my arm away. Never was I much the one for expressing grief. I ignored my father, and when he came out of his bedroom on the 4th day, freshly shaved, ready for work, Jerry and I exhaled a sigh of relief. We could never have guessed he would color his walls with a smatter of pink and red the day after that. I cried, and I did it through an ocean of salty water. For once, I understood the floodgates of my father. Jerry wouldn't, though. He was far better than even I at constructing that metaphorical dam. "Are we going to die?" asked Jake. "No," snapped Courtney, her face now long dry. I finished my beer in a few quick chugs and flicked the cigarette butt into the empty can. I don't know what we're gonna do, I said to the knife block on the counter. We're going to survive, said Courtney. God, I hope you're right, I replied. I am. Guess I'm scaring the kids, aren't I asked with a raised eyebrow. They probably should be. I know I am. I know you are too. Jack pipped. I'm not scared. I am, said Frankie. Sometimes it's okay to be scared, Jake, I said. He bit his lip and his eyes wandered around the room, never fixing on one place. Steve, the mutt, placed his head and forepaws across my ankles as I sat on the floor. His animal eyes flickered back and forth in that way they do, almost as though animals present in a conversation are trying to interpret our words far beyond their diction. Well, that's enough of that, I said, wiping my eyes and standing. Steve looked at me as though I'd somehow offended him by removing my legs from beneath his head. Any ideas? I asked while scanning the room. I'm literally open to anything. Well, said Frankie, cocking his head, we should stop them from getting in. I yawned through my response. I'm getting tired again. Better pump myself with some of that sweet, sweet coffee. We've got weapons. We've got the windows boarded up. I looked down at the little boy. Under normal circumstances, kid, I'd humor you. But it's big boy thinking cap time. We could try to communicate with them, said Jake. I raised an eyebrow. Possibly. I stepped over to the back door, flung it in, and waved to one of the figures out there, moving around the house in open space. Hey! I yelled out at them. One of them seemed to take a moment's hesitation, but continued moving in its circular fashion, ignoring my call. We're lost. You want to help us? I asked. No response. I closed the door and turned to Jake. That plan's about as fruitful as I thought it'd be. We could jump, said Courtney. See where it goes? This startled me, and I caught her eye before she twisted in her seat to gaze at the candle on the table. That isn't the best plan I've heard so far. Is the car out there? Asked Frank. That's a good question. I stepped around them and moved to the door on the side of the house nearest where we parked the car. I opened it and saw nothing but open space. Shutting it back, I said, Come on guys, we need some real ideas. Just then, the floor quaked beneath us again and my stomach flopped, knowing well that we were suspended over nothing but open air. Damn it, if they wanted to, they could just come straight through this house and murder every one of us. Why not? Something's happening, screamed little Frank. There he was, the little boy standing in front of us, as inconsequential and slight as any other. Then, he wasn't any longer. He squealed and grabbed hold of his head with both hands, his shrieking reaching a climax that only Steve could hear probably. His eyes were clenched, and when they opened again, his eyes burst forth with a wondrous blinding light and his feet left the ground. The rest of us in the room scrambled from the levitating boy. That was when he spoke in a voice not his own. It was an unfathomable ferocity that struck our ears. He spoke. You have been chosen to look on me. The light coming from his eyes grew brighter till we heard a shattering noise like hot glass bulbs. I didn't hear the small boy crash to the floor, but when I was able to look upon him again and the light from his eyes had gone, I caught bile in my outstretched hand. Jake cried out, His eyes! Lil Frank's eyes had swollen and burst from his head in a firework explosion of blood and viscera, spattering the room and all of us in its wet gore. I'm sure I know the phrase, "Oh my fucking God," for I'm sure I hushed it from my panicked lips 1,000 times over as I held that little boy's head in my lap, attempting to stuff his empty eye sockets with my removed shirt. I held my hand against his chest and felt it rise and fall. He's alive. Thank God he's alive. We surrounded him in a semicircle, static between trying to aid him and trying to move him awake again. I felt his forehead, and it was blistering hot like the end of a fire poker. I let go of him as Courtney held him into her outstretched arms. As my wife dabbed at the edges of Frank's eyes with my shirt, she looked up at me with wild, fearful eyes. I strode over and grabbed the single shot in a huff, pacing back and forth. Who was that speaking through him? Maybe Courtney's right. Maybe we should jump into the epithesis of nothing. No. As Courtney tended to little Frank, I found myself in a flurry of overwhelming emotions, pulling me every which way. This had to come to a head at some point. All this madness, all this confusion. Now someone was hurt, and I had to do something. Jake followed underfoot, mimicking my motions. "Get out of my way, goddammit," I said. Jake stepped away from me with a protruding bottom lip, and I shoved him against the wall, rushing towards the back door. I opened it, fired a shot towards those swirling creatures without really aiming, and slammed the door shut. "Does that make you feel better?" asked Courtney. "Does that make you feel like you can protect everyone now?" I sighed and threw the gun to the floor, falling to my knees and scooching closer to her, huddled over the boy. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't know what else to do." "We can start by handing me that," said Courtney, pointing to the emergency medical kit. I crossed the room and handed it to her. I watched as she removed the bottle of alcohol and disinfected the immediate area around Frankie's wounds. I grimaced as she removed my shirt from his head to expose the 2 open holes there. There wasn't anything we could do to stop this. We were in the palm of an unjust God. She cradled his head. I looked away, and Steve whined at my feet, scratching at my shoe. Absently, I stroked his ear. An incalculable amount of time passed, and we laid Lil Frank on the couch, wrapping gauze around his head to cover his no eyes. He was feverish and his muscles grew restless, for he moved in his sleep, flailing his arms and legs around sporadically every 30 minutes or so. He spoke in indiscernible mumbles. We waited for him to recover, whatever that meant. Can you recover from something like that? Neither me nor Courtney knew anything about treating a child in such a state. We could do nothing but replace his soaked bandages as they flooded. "You should sleep," said Courtney. "You look rough." "Gee, thanks," I said. Jacob had long since fallen asleep sitting upright near the couch, with his little brother's hand in his own. "I'm serious," she said. "You've been getting agitated more and more. We have to keep a cool head." Her stern expression showed that she only meant to quell the impending doom creeping in all around us. "All right," I said. "But if anything new happens, I'll wake you Courtney lifted the single shot and walked to the threshold where Jacob and I had taken our watch. I slid over to where Jacob was sit-sleeping, and he shifted before nestling his head against my shoulder. While staring at the dead TV, I was certain I would have a difficult time sleeping. But as I closed my eyes, I was almost immediately taken away. I awoke and jumped to my feet, scanning the empty room. The little boy lying on the couch was gone, and so too were his century of a brother. Alone I was in that horrific dreamscape as I thundered through the house, searching for my family. "Hello?" I screamed throughout the rooms, making as much noise as I possibly could, hoping that one of them would peer around the corner and I would feel the reassuring warmth of their presence. No one could be found. I was alone. Had the Watchers come and taken them while I'd let my guard down? That had to have been the case. I had let them down. I had let my wife down. The boys were gone. Courtney was gone. Sucked into the black void outside. I felt my body grow cold with each passing second. Every moment that I could not find them, my panic stretched to infinity and rubber-banded into the back of my throat. I swung the outside doors of the old house open, staring off into the beautiful black space that went on forever in all directions. There were no yellow-eyed Watchers out there in that moment. Just the open air and me. I stepped into the yonder, feeling my hair lift from my head and trail behind me like millions of minuscule tails. I looked on and saw the tendrils twisting from the depths below, holding on to the house above like Atlas with the world on his shoulders. Looking up, I watched the house above disappear, and it seemed like I would fall forever. The wind whipped through my body and sent my feet over my head through the void. It seemed like I could fall forever. Perhaps I already had. Perhaps I'd been doing this all along. There was never an Uncle Derek or a past. No future. This was the zenith of existence. What a dream. I awoke in a nightmare sweat without Jake leaning on my shoulder. This sent me rushing to stand, but I calmed as I saw him standing near the boarded bay window, attempting to peer out. My shoulders relaxed. "See anything out there, bud?" I asked. He shook his head. Jacob's demeanor reflected that of a tired old man. My heart went out to him, but I was too far gone to address his growing up properly. I crossed the room to the threshold, to the kitchen, and saw my wife slumped in the chair there. As I approached, she stirred awake. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flash of hot anger. "You're supposed to be watching for those things out there. What are you doing?" I clenched my jaw and pushed the anger away. "Hello, sleepyhead," I said. "Sorry," she said, offering a wipe at the sand in her eyes as proof that she was wary. "It's all good." I stretched the sleep from my body and waved my hand in front of my open mouth. "They still out there?" "Last I checked," she said. "I don't like looking out there, though. They give me the heebie-jeebies." I lifted a bottle of water from our gathered supplies and drank it greedily while attempting to catch a glimpse of the Watchers through the window. There they were, as ever. "I think we're going to die here," I said. Courtney flinched, but ultimately relaxed and said, "Don't say that." I sipped the water. No, I mean it. What are we doing here? Surviving? I don't want to survive. I don't want to give them the satisfaction. We could put the kids to sleep. Then ourselves. We have enough ammo for that, at least. I couldn't bring myself to part my lips and say this bit, but given the way that she fondled at the end of the gown, she knew exactly what I meant. She slammed her fist against the side of her chair and said, "Enough!" I watched her shoulders square as she barreled down the hallway. Jacob entered the room, inspecting the disturbance. When she returned, she had a little black plastic box with speakers on either side. A battery-operated CD player. She shifted the 2-foot-long black box into the counter, striking the play button like a tambourine with her open palm. Immediately, my ears were met with the sound of a keyboard, melodic, followed by unidentifiable synth instrumentals. The bugles. "Video Killed the Radio Star" exploded from the box. I was more than a little baffled as my gaze went from the flexing speakers of the radio box to my wife, mock boots stepping in her bare feet, sliding them along the kitchen tiles. This was from a mix CD I'd given her when we'd first started dating years ago. Her mouth mimicked the voice coming through the radio. Jacob looked on in bewilderment. She spun and let her nightgown flow out in all directions like a wildflower dancer. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked. She sang along, ignoring my protest. "Have you lost your damn mind?" She stopped mid-spin, looking me up and down. "Quite contrary, Derek. I found it." Then she began lifting her feet, dancing in a high-stepping Appalachian fashion. "Are you okay?" wavered Jake. "I'm great," she responded through a heaving breath. "Dance! Let those bastards come and get us." I watched my wife. She was right. She'd not lost a thing in the world. She found it. What was it that humans did in the most perilous of circumstances? They defied them. I understood that's what she intended to do. This was not an escapist fantasy. There was no madness here, only humanity. As Mr. Roboto came over the radio, I too joined in the play dance, moving my arms like stiff blocks through the air. Jacob watched us with horrific fascination, till Courtney grabbed him by the hands, forcing him to drop his hammer and taking him away on the whims of a crazed revelry. I belted out the lyrics of the song, lifting the hammer from its place on the floor, and twisted my jiggling body to the window over the sink, jamming the claw into the screws and nails there, prying them away from the window and tearing down the trim. Courtney laughed as I did so, and even Jacob seemed carried away in the strangeness of it all. I was a bolstered man, a person ready for anything. If they could get us with the boards, then so be it. There shan't be any fortifications. I clambered the metal end of the hammer through the glass, watching it break away and fall into the yonder blue. So it was that I did the same on the rest of the windows of the house. In our reveling, we swung the kitchen door in and placed the radio at its mouth for the watchers to hear. "How do you like that?" I shouted at the circling figures. "You want to torment us? I don't think so. How do you like these tunes?" I twisted the dial to the max. The watchers did not waver in their formation, and I spit in their direction. "Come and get us," I taunted. Steve watched us with astute curiosity, inconsistently wagging his tail when we'd catch his eye or growling at the watchers as he caught a glimpse of them. I lifted the crisper drawer full of beers from the dark fridge and slid it among the floor, taking up in the open back doorway with the single shot between my spread legs. I watched over and popped a tab. Courtney followed suit and pulled up a chair to watch me. She popped her tab, and as she did so, I caught Jacob ogling the clear crisper drawer. "Go ahead," I told the boy. Before reaching into the crisper, he looked to Courtney for admission. She nodded, and he too cracked a top. We crowded in around the door, and I took aim, firing a shell into the watcher's alignment. They were either impervious to the scatters, or I was the worst shot in the world. They're impervious. "She don't use jelly," I sang along to the next song coming over the speakers. Bang, reload, sip, bang, reload. "Give me a go on it," said Courtney. I slid along the floor on my bottom, handing the gun off to her. As she propped the gun against her shoulder, she looked calm, and I was impressed with her stance. She closed an eye, looked down the sight, and fired. Bang. I watched as a pair of those floating yellow eyes staggered and swam downward through the air. It disappeared. Courtney jumped up and down in a display of trimmering satisfaction. "I got one!" "Holy shit," I said. "You should definitely hold on to that." I pointed to the gun with my hand holding my beer. Jacob's soft chuckle caught my attention. I angled my neck to look at him. "Oh, you think that's funny, huh?" He nodded. "A little." I wheezed through a sip. "What's that?" asked Jacob, leaning around Courtney to look out into the darkness. I followed suit. A cyclopean mass of something was coming our way. The outline of a humongous black orb could be seen wading through the yonder. The thing looked to have the consistency of a cratered meatball. No, not cratered. The holes about the huge orb's face seemed to channel all the way to its center, and from them came the clicking mess of limbs. The massive ball came to rest perhaps 10 yards from our back door, spinning awkward and slow. We looked on in awe at the onyx globe. "What is it?" said Courtney, reloading the gun and stepping away from the door. "Fuck if I know." "What are those things coming from it?" asked Jacob. "Looks like segmented legs, like a bug," I said, unsure if the description could do them justice, for they each moved independently of one another as the pointed ends of the stick limbs scraped against the surface of its body. They reached out in all directions too, contracting and extending and feeling the black air. Just then, the childish cries of Frank in the living room could be heard. I darted to him in a hurry, dropping my half-drank beer. As I rounded the corner, I saw him sitting straight up from the couch as though he'd had a metal rod shoved down his back. His hands clung to his face, fingers clambering to remove the gauze we'd placed there. "I can't see!" he screamed. "Why can't I see?" I shivered at these words, feeling the skin across my neck contract at the realization he didn't understand what happened to him. I rushed to his side, grabbing his arms and holding them down so that he could not claw at his bandages. "Shh," I attempted to calm him. "Shh, it's okay, Frank. It is not okay, Buckaroo. You're okay. Just breathe, buddy. Calm down." He spazzed against me, twisting all around while trying to place his foot against my chest to push me away. "Uncle Derek?" His head craned in all directions. "Is that you?" He began to cry, and the blood began to ooze from the bottom of the gauze. "Why can't I see?" he sobbed. "Please, get this thing off my eyes." I choked. "It's okay, bud." "Where am I? I'm so cold. I don't see anything around me. Why can't I see anything?" Right then,
I knew I'd reached my breaking point. And just as I opened my mouth to tell him he had no eyes and that's why he couldn't see, he stiffly flopped back onto the couch like a plank of wood, gone from the words falling from my mouth. I shook the boy and he didn't respond. Looking over my shoulder, I saw Jacob and Courtney standing in the threshold. "Come here," she said. "You need to see this." I lifted little Frank in both arms and marched to the kitchen, placing him upright against the fridge. "I'm so sorry. I won't let you out of my sight." I pivoted to look out the door and saw the horror there, with its many legs closer, so that it seemed at any moment one of its pointed appendages could reach out and snatch the roof off the house. The radio played another pop hit from days gone by. I reached over and flicked the knob off. "What do you want?" I whispered. "What are you doing?" asked Courtney, stepping in beside me to grab my hand. Jacob stood by me opposite side, both hands clasped around the hammer. "I'm talking to it," I said. "Why?" she asked. "Do you think it can understand us?" "I don't know." I squeezed her slender fingers. "Yeah," said Jake. "What do you want?" The orb stopped its spinning. I am unsure how to describe the horror's way of communication, for it had no face and therefore no mouth. But we all heard its resounding voice all the same. It shook the world around us and threatened to divide the house down its very middle as it spoke.
"I am Worm," exclaimed the legged floating globe. "You have been chosen to look on me, for I am a jealous god."
Steve let out a guttural moan, cramming himself under Frank's limp arm.
"I am all there is. I am all there ever will be. I am what has always been."
"Why us?" My throat was dry. It ignored this.
"Come to me, children. Look on my catastrophe. Look upon my works and lose yourself in the wonder that is me."
Then there was light, and it was bad. Beams of white light poured from the openings in the surface of Worm, illuminating all there was. We were not suspended in an open void of nothingness, as previously suspected, but we were risen in a massive chamber of colossal proportions. Peeking over the edge of the doorway, I saw that the massive tentacles reaching up to support the weight of the house was not merely a fever dream, but a godforsaken reality. The tentacles down there spawned forth from pustules with dimpled centers, and they glistened in the blinding light with sickening clarity.
"I am Worm," said the globe. "Look on my works and tremble."
We did. The chamber itself had the consistency of the interior of a creature. Exposed ribbing lined the chambers, and when I dared look at the ceiling, I could see where the translucent bulges of pink skin met at a swollen vertebrae line. The light of Worm exposed the orb for what it was, and I reeled upon seeing its true form. I cannot describe it here, because no human words could ever do the thing justice. I did not look on my family while I studied the chamber, as I could not peel my eyes from the scenery. The Watchers danced in the aerial circle around the house in cloaks like trim, frail humanoids with angular, hairless features. The Watchers' eyes were not that of any human I'd seen before, or since, because they were so biologically improbable. The eyes were not organic material, but huge light bulbs with fire-hot yellow filaments pushed into what were otherwise empty sockets. I heard Jacob retch beside me. Courtney's grip on my hand clenched ever more, but I couldn't feel the pain emanating there. This is hell, said my wife.
No,
said Worm.
This is I. This is me.
That's when Frank wriggled from his sick slumber and joined the rest of us. Again, the poor boy felt around blindly, wildly, hoping to cling onto anything as a guidepost. Courtney went to the boy, stroking his hair and grabbing his hand to comfort him. But he was having none of it, spitting and swinging his tiny fists in a flurry that met with her chest and face. She recoiled. Steve had long since moved out of the striking distance of the boy and taken refuge underneath the kitchen table. This is madness.
Not madness,
said Worm, somehow reading my thoughts.
It is merely beyond your comprehension. The boy, you call him Little Frank. He is suitable.
Don't you dare, I said. Worm did not pay any mind to this. Instead, Frank began reeling in pain, stretching his neck to its terminus with veins and muscles standing out against his pale flesh. Frank's head lolled back, and fire-hot yellow light fired from his socket so violently it came through the gauze. I staggered, grabbing onto the frame of the door, if only not to drop onto the floor, or worse yet, tumble to my doom far below. "Help!" screamed Frank. "Please help!" My stomach churned as his pleas vibrated in my ear canal. Frank rose off the ground, levitating to the ceiling, bumping his head and swinging through the air like a rag doll. His small frame, limp, swung through the air with needless legs and arms. Torso is frozen straight. Jacob grabbed at his little brother's legs, yanking at his shoes, trying to bring him back to the floor. "No!" moaned Jake, his slanted eyes and dribbling lips forever burned in my memory. The shoe in his hand slipped from Frank's foot and plopped to the floor. I too snatched the floating little boy, grabbing onto him with pinching fingers as he passed through the doorway, almost pulling me along with him. I let him go, and his shirt collar popped from my hand. Everything in the chamber went black once more, and the only thing that could be seen was the eyes of the Watchers, spinning and floating out there like macabre guides in the dark black sea of the void. Worm grabbed hold of the frame of the house with the points of his onyx insect limbs and shoved himself away from us. floating into that infinite black space. The sheen of the globe's surface disappeared until there was only an outline in the void. Eventually, even that was gone. The formation of circling watchers had a new link in their chain, and I shut the door to ignore it. We were in a drowning silence. Jake had no qualms clinging to Courtney's gown after his brother's passage to Worm. "What now?" asked Jake, his voice delicate, small. I leaned against the wall near the back door and kicked off the baseboard, standing it with the rubber on my shoe. Pacing the kitchen, I hoped I could find something to say. Steve followed me with his eyes from beneath the table. I couldn't answer. I didn't want to answer, because I knew that anything I said would be wrong.
There are dark gods that exist in one plane of existence or another. I can say that with absolute certainty. Whether the proverbial Christian God or any other is out there and looking out at us, I can't say. But I am positive that there are things out there that call themselves God, and they are not looking out for us. Courtney took up in the kitchen chair, staring at her hands like a statue. She sat expressionless, painless. Jake, with no tears or yelps or cries of pain, took up a game of tossing his empty beer can across the kitchen floor and having Steve bring it back in his slobbering mouth. Steve, unaware as ever, wagged his tail and scanned the room for pats as he'd go. Clang. The metal can would go as it slid across the tiles and met the cabinet door, and Jake watched it do this, never issuing a good boy to the dog that retrieved it, never looking anywhere else at all. I watched my family and felt like I was falling through that nightmare all over again. You've got a real problem, Buckaroo. It was a simple job. It should have been a simple job. All you had to do was watch your brother's kids over the weekend so he could get some hanky-panky. Why couldn't you even do that? I know why. It's the same reason you couldn't stop that bastard that got your wife. Get your shit together. I wanted to fall to my knees and yank my hair out in wild man tufts. I wanted to fling myself over the edge of the back door into the black nothing out there. I wanted to take my father's route and see how much that scattershot could spread my brains around. Instead, I fired the gun into the black night, making sure to never aim at the yellow-eyed watchers, as I was sure Lil Frankie was among their ranks. Perhaps it was that I just wanted Worm to acknowledge my presence. The joke was on me, though, because it never seemed to do any good. Fucking great, I said, barely above a whisper, shakily reloading the gun.
Courtney shifted her gaze to me just as I was about to fire another round into Worm. Or maybe not Worm. Or maybe everything's Worm. I can't say. "What?" she asked. I said fucking great. I looked down the barrel and squeezed the trigger. Thunder and light erupted from the useless boomstick.
"Uncle Derek said a bad word,"
muttered Jake, stiffly, without looking up from the sliding empty beer can. "You need to get your shit together," she said, shaking her head. "See? She's right." I reloaded. "Get my shit together," I stammered. I just watched my nephew float away. He's out there, spiraling around the house, a pawn of some eldritch fucking god. Excuse me if my shit is a little out of sorts. I flailed my arms up and down, sweat beading around my hairline. Not all of us can just shrug off when traumatic shit happens. I was furious. I was cold. I sat the gun down on the kitchen table and pivoted to face her. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" she asked, standing to her feet. "You know what it means, don't you?" I exclaimed. "Bad shit happens, and sometimes you've got to process it. Sometimes you've got to talk about it. Sometimes you got to fall apart a little so you can put yourself back together the right way." "You're one to talk." She pointed a straight index finger in my direction. "All you ever do is talk about me showing my feelings, but you never do. You get mad, you get upset, you make it about you." She swept her foot along the floor, slamming it into a chair leg. "God damn it, Derek! Not everyone thinks that breaking dishes or setting up bear traps or being destructive is the best way to process their shit." Each word was a prodding needle. "Oh yeah? Well, it's better than not expressing anything, isn't it?" As I said it, I watched her eye twitch in response, and I knew I'd gone too far. But I wasn't done. You pretend it doesn't happen. You act like nothing's out of the ordinary. You don't have any emotions when it hits the fan. Clang, said the empty beer can. "I have emotions," she said, and didn't yell. Her brow took on thick ravines. "I have emotions," she repeated. "How can you think I don't?" "I didn't mean that." "No, of course you did. I know exactly what you meant. I didn't want to go to therapy when I got raped. I didn't want to talk to you about it. I didn't want to express myself. So naturally, that means I don't have any emotions." Clang. "That's not what I meant." I felt small. I felt weak. I felt the worst feeling one lover can feel from another. I felt misinterpreted. She didn't hear me. "Go on. You think I'm just some cold, unfeeling, heartless woman because I had something bad happen to me, and now you're upset because I don't feel like fucking you?" My stomach churned. That's what it really is, isn't it? I had some real bad shit happen to me, and now you think I'm all broken because I can't muster up the courage to please you as a dutiful wife should. You want to know why I can't fuck you? Clang. I did not want to know that. Because every time you touch me, it brings it back. Her bottom lip quivered in a mixture of vitriol and sorrow. I wish it didn't, alright? He took it from me. You've got nothing to do with it.
She sat again in her chair and covered her face. And acting like a chest-beating gorilla isn't going to change that. I went to her, hunkering onto the balls of my feet and trying to find her fingers through the mess of tears. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry." They tell you when you're a child that apologizing fixes it most of the time. But no matter how many times those words fell from my mouth, it never felt whole again. Clang. An immeasurable amount of time passed, and at some point, Jake turned the music back on. He watched the speakers and didn't move. Played a Brandi Carlile song called "The Story." It was one that Courtney and I would listen to in the Jetta before we got married. We would sit on the hood of the car in the park and look at the stars as it played. It was a tune we'd played at our wedding, for God's sake. It didn't feel the same anymore. It felt like the female vocalist was screeching at me more than singing. I'll never forgive myself for what happened to Courtney, just like I'll never forgive myself for what happened to my nephew. That much is certain. We took ourselves to the living room and waited for something, anything, to happen. We waited for what seemed forever. With no time in that place, the word itself could scarcely have meant a thing. Eventually, though, we found a torturous, sweating sleep. I was the last to blink out. I watched first Jake pass away into the tight, kicking slumber, and then my wife. They laid together on the couch, heads opposite one another. Continuously, my gaze was pulled to the bay window. I sat beside it in a chair and watched the watchers circle the house, their rhythmic movements lulling me to sleep. I awoke to daylight with my head pressed against the glass. I briefly thought the bright eyes of the watchers had come to the window, but it wasn't so. Looking out, I could see the countryside, the trees across the road, the gravel driveway leading to the side of the house. Stomping to my feet, I clambered to my sleeping family and shook them awake. Courtney came up in a fit, followed by Jake. They stared out the window mesmerized and said nothing. We went to the side door and found the Jetta waiting for us as it ever was. I looked to the backyard, to the thick line of trees out there. Nothing lurked. It's been quite some time since Worm took my nephew. Upon calling the police, they searched the woods. The three of us, I think, all knew they'd find nothing there. I've not spoken to Jake or my brother in years now. Jerry gave me a swift fat lip in frustration one day after combing the forest. He blames me. I blame me. I took it and said nothing. Courtney's gone too. She lingered around for a while after they called the search to an end. We both knew we were done. I received the divorce papers in the mail, and they've been sitting by my bedside table since. The single shot sits there too, leaned against the wall. I'll use one of them someday, I know. So, it's just me in that old house. I sit on the back porch most nights with Steve, my belly swollen from beer and my lungs full of tobacco smoke. I wait and I watch. And sometimes, I swear, I can see little yellow eyes in those woods.
Chronicler here. We here at Creepy Spaghet would like to thank EdwardTheCrazyMan for allowing us to tell their story. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on these terrible tales, and make sure to check out the author in the links below. If you're interested in having your story narrated, be sure to reach out to our humble overseer, as he continues his journey to pull the darkest stories from the infinite depths of the internet. Until next time, fiends. And remember, we are darkness.